For decades, the world thought it knew Michael Jackson. But buried inside his own biology was a secret so profound and so unexpected that even the people closest to him never saw it coming. What scientists uncovered was not just a medical diagnosis, it was the hidden story of who Michael Jackson truly was, written in the language of DNA itself. Michael Jackson was born on August 29, 1958, in Gary, Indiana. He was the seventh of 9 children born to Joseph and Catherine Jackson. From the very beginning, the world was watching. By the time he was 5 years old, he was already performing on stage with his brothers. By the time he was 10, he had a record deal. By the time he was 13, he had a #1 hit. The world did not give Michael Jackson time to be a child, and it certainly did not give him time to be a mystery. Everything about him was supposed to be known, examined, and consumed by a public that treated his life like an open book, written exclusively for their entertainment. Every performance, every album, every public appearance was dissected with an intensity that most people will never experience and could never fully understand from the outside looking in. But there were things happening inside Michael Jackson that no one in the audience could see. Things written not in the pages of a tabloid, not in the lyrics of a song, but in the microscopic language of biology itself. His DNA was carrying stories. Stories about who he was, where he came from, and what his body was doing to him every single day of his life. Stories that the world either refused to believe or simply did not have the tools to understand. And those stories, it turns out, are far more extraordinary than anything the tabloids ever invented. Let us start at the beginning of what science has actually told us about Michael Jackson. And to do that, we have to go back to a moment that changed everything. Not a concert, not a record, not a performance, but a single television interview that left 62 million Americans sitting in complete silence in front of their screens. It was 1993. Michael Jackson sat down with Oprah Winfrey for what became one of the most watched interviews in television history. The world expected gossip. The world expected drama. What they got instead was a man sitting quietly and telling a truth so simple, so medical, and so entirely mundane in its clinical reality that it somehow still managed to shock an entire generation. He had vitiligo. That was the truth. That was the secret that his changing skin had been hiding, or rather, that the world had been hiding from itself. Because it was far more entertaining to accuse him of hating who he was than to simply believe him when he said his skin was sick. Vitiligo is an autoimmune condition. That is the first thing science needs you to understand. And it is the thing that changes everything else about how you look at Michael Jackson's life. An autoimmune condition means that the body's immune system, the very system designed to protect you, to keep you alive, to fight off the things trying to hurt you, turns against itself. In the case of vitiligo, the immune system targets and destroys melanocytes. Melanocytes are the cells responsible for producing melanin, the pigment that gives skin its color. When those cells are attacked and destroyed, the skin loses its pigment in that area. The result is patches of white skin, irregular in shape, unpredictable in spread, and impossible to fully control. You cannot negotiate with vitiligo. You cannot convince your immune system to stand down through willpower or diet or meditation. The disease follows its own biological timeline, and the person living with it simply has to follow along. For a man with dark skin, the contrast is stark and immediate and visible. For a man who performed under lights on stages in front of millions of people, it was devastating. And for a man whose entire image was already under a microscope, it became the subject of a cultural conversation so cruel and so dishonest that it took decades and a coroner's report to finally put it to rest. Dr. Arnold Klein, Michael Jackson's dermatologist, first began noticing the depigmenting patches on Jackson's skin around 1983, right around the time Thriller was taking over the world. By 1986, he had biopsied the skin and confirmed the diagnosis officially. At that point, there were 2 conditions confirmed on that biopsy report. Vitiligo was one. The other was discoid lupus erythematosus, a form of cutaneous lupus that also affects skin pigment and texture and is itself another autoimmune disorder. So Michael Jackson was not dealing with one condition attacking his skin. He was dealing with 2 separate autoimmune diseases simultaneously, both of them targeting the very thing the public had already decided to make the center of their ridicule. 2 diseases confirmed by biopsy in 1986. While the world was still years away from even beginning to ask the question seriously, here's what science tells us about how vitiligo progresses. It does not spread at a predictable pace. According to research published through Harvard Health, vitiligo may progress in waves with rapid pigment loss, followed by long periods where symptoms stabilize. For some people, it affects small patches on the hands or face and goes no further. For others, particularly those with a severe and widespread form of the condition, the depigmentation eventually covers most or all of the body. Michael Jackson fell into that second category. By the time his autopsy was conducted in 2009, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Report formally documented what his doctors had been saying for decades: focal depigmentation of the skin across 5 separate areas of his body. That was in the official record. That was in the science. That was in the truth that had always been available to anyone willing to look at the documentation rather than the headlines. But the truth did not sell newspapers the way the rumors did. And so the diagnosis that should have ended the conversation became for many people just another thing to be skeptical about. Surely he was lying. Surely this was a cover story. Surely a man could not change that dramatically from the inside out without choosing to, without wanting to, without there being some deeper and darker motivation behind every patch of white skin. What science actually tells us about that darker narrative is this: there is no known medical procedure that can bleach an entire person's skin evenly and safely. There is no treatment that could have turned Michael Jackson from dark to uniformly lighter without causing catastrophic and obvious harm to his body. What did exist, and what Jackson did use, was a prescription treatment called monobenzone, sometimes sold under the brand name Benequin. This is a topical cream that has been FDA approved specifically for the purpose of depigmenting the remaining pigmented skin in patients with widespread vitiligo. The logic is medical and practical. When a person has lost pigmentation across the majority of their body, the patchy contrast between white and dark skin is itself medically significant. It creates uneven sun sensitivity, increased risk of certain skin complications, and in Jackson's very public case, an appearance that the media was using as a weapon against him daily. Depigmentation therapy, when used under medical supervision, creates a more uniform skin tone by treating the remaining pigmented areas. It is not cosmetic in the way the tabloids described it. It is a medical decision made in consultation with a physician for a patient with a genuine autoimmune disease. Michael Jackson was not trying to be someone else. His DNA was doing something to his body that he did not choose, did not want, and could not stop. And yet, the world chose the more interesting story. The world chose the narrative that felt more satisfying, more scandalous, even before there were clicks to count. Now, here is where the story of Michael Jackson's DNA takes an entirely different and equally fascinating turn, because what the world fixated on was the surface of his skin. What genetic genealogy researchers quietly uncovered was something much deeper. The origin story of who his family actually was, traced back through generations, through slavery, through survival, through a lie that the Jackson family had been living with for more than a century without even knowing it was a lie. The Jackson family had always believed and often shared a piece of family history that felt like both a point of pride and a mystery. They believed that their ancestor, a man known as July Jack Gale, was born to a Native American father. This was the oral history that had been passed down through generations. Native American ancestry and the mythology of many African American families was a story that carried layers of meaning, identity, pride, an explanation for certain physical features, a connection to the land. Joe Jackson, Michael's father, was known for his green eyes and the reddish undertones in his appearance that seemed to lend the story some visual credibility. The family held on to this piece of their history with the quiet confidence of people who had heard it so many times it had simply become fact. But DNA does not care about oral history. DNA does not honor the stories families tell themselves to make sense of the past. DNA is a scientific document, and when a genetic genealogist and researcher named Sherman McRae began working with a distant paternal cousin of Michael Jackson's named Thomas Jackson III, what they found in the Y chromosome data told a completely different story than the one the Jackson family had believed for generations. Thomas Jackson III shares a common ancestor with Michael Jackson. Both men descend from a man named Nero Jackson, making them distant cousins through the paternal line. When Thomas submitted his DNA for Y chromosome testing through family tree DNA, the results pointed him toward a haplogroup that had nothing to do with Native American origins. His Y DNA fell into a classification called R1b, a sub-branch of the broader R1b haplogroup that is overwhelmingly associated with Western Europe, specifically with French ancestry. This was not a marginal result. This was not an ambiguous reading. The science pointed clearly and unambiguously toward France. Researchers dug further. They found a match. A male descendant of a French family named Richbourg was showing up in the database, sharing the same terminal genetic marker as Thomas Jackson III. And when genealogists began tracing the paper trail to match the DNA trail, the story that emerged was one of the oldest and most painful stories in American history. July Jack Gale, the ancestor that the Jackson family believed had Native American roots, was not the son of a Native American man. He was the son of his enslaver, a Frenchman named James Joel Richbourg. The DNA confirmed it. The historical records, when traced back to Sumter, South Carolina, confirmed it. James Joel Richbourg died in 1804 and left July in his will, bequeathing him to his daughter Mary, who had married a man named Josiah Gale. That is where the name Gale came from. That is how July went from being the unacknowledged son of an enslaver to being an enslaved person with a new surname on a new plantation, carrying none of the legal recognition of his biological parentage and all of the generational trauma of that erasure. His entire identity, his name, his supposed ancestry, even the story his descendants would tell about him for generations, was shaped by the violence and silence of American slavery. The family tree DNA analysis, documented through their genealogy research blog and later discussed in Genetic Genealogy, Communities, places Michael Jackson's paternal line within haplogroup R1b. The haplogroup data traces back to France. The common ancestor of both the Jackson and Richborg lines in that database predates 1750. The story the family told about Native American ancestry was not a fabrication in the deliberate sense. It was almost certainly a story that developed in the way so many family stories develop, when a truth is too painful to be spoken directly. The shame of slave rape, the desire to give a fatherless ancestor a different and more dignified origin, the quiet substitution of one ancestry for another. These are things that happened in thousands of African American families across generations, and they are things that Y chromosome testing is now gently and sometimes brutally correcting. Michael Jackson never knew this. There's no record that anyone in the Jackson family at the time had access to the kind of genetic testing that would have revealed it. The research emerged years after his death, pieced together by a cousin he likely never met in partnership with genealogists whose entire purpose is to use DNA to recover the truths that history buried. But it matters enormously. It matters because it is part of the complete picture of who Michael Jackson was at a biological level, the level that the world so often talked about but so rarely actually investigated with any scientific rigor. There is another dimension to the DNA story surrounding Michael Jackson, and this one is murkier, less scientifically verified and far more sensationalized, though it was sensationalized in 2014 and largely forgotten since, which says something important about how seriously it was taken even at the time. A Beverly Hills dental surgeon named Joseph Goodman came forward claiming to have obtained a DNA sample from a dental device that had once belonged to Jackson, purchased at auction, and announced that a singer named Brandon Howard was a 99. 9% DNA match to the King of Pop, suggesting that Howard was Jackson's biological son from an undisclosed relationship. The problems with this claim were numerous and immediate. The chain of custody for a dental device purchased at auction is not a controlled scientific environment. There is no peer-reviewed methodology attached to this test. There was no independent verification from any credentialed institution. Howard himself, after initially participating in the publicity surrounding the test, released a statement distancing himself from the entire situation shortly afterward. The Jackson estate denied the claims. No subsequent credible scientific body ever validated the results. The story lasted approximately 2 news cycles and then disappeared. Speaking of his children, this is perhaps the most emotionally complex corner of the DNA conversation surrounding Jackson. He had 3 children. Prince Michael, born in 1997, is the oldest. Paris was born in 1998. Blanket, whose legal name is Prince Michael II, was born in 2002. Their mother, or at least the legal and acknowledged mother of the 2 oldest, is Debbie Rowe, Jackson's second wife, who revealed after his death that she was inseminated and subsequently signed away her parental rights in exchange for financial settlement. Blanket was born by a surrogate. No official DNA test has ever been publicly conducted or released confirming or denying Michael Jackson's biological relationship to any of his 3 children. His children have said they are biologically his. Debbie Rowe has spoken publicly about the circumstances of the pregnancies. The children themselves have chosen not to take DNA tests, and that choice deserves the same respect we would extend to anyone navigating a deeply personal question about identity and parentage in front of a world that has always believed it has a right to know everything. Their DNA, whatever it may contain, is theirs. It is not public property. What is remarkable about all of this, when you step back and look at the full picture that science has actually painted, is how consistently the truth has been more complicated and more human than the rumors. The story of Michael Jackson's skin is not a story about a man who was ashamed of being black. It is a story about an autoimmune disease attacking his melanocytes, confirmed by his doctors, confirmed by his autopsy, and documented in the scientific literature on vitiligo in a way that will outlast every tabloid headline ever written about him. The story of his ancestry is not a story about what any family believed to be true. It is a story about why chromosomes tracing a French Huguenot line through the horror of American slavery through generations of silence about how that line actually began, and into the present day where genetic genealogy has quietly and permanently corrected the record. The science does not make Michael Jackson into a saint. The science does not resolve every controversy about his life or exonerate him from every accusation ever made against him. What the science does is give us the biological truth about who he was, what was happening inside his body, where his ancestors actually came from, and what his DNA was saying in the language that only researchers with the right tools could translate. And the most striking thing about that biological truth is how much of it he tried to tell us himself. He told Oprah Winfrey about the vitiligo in 1993, and 62 million people heard it and then largely chose not to believe it. He spoke repeatedly and publicly about the pain of having a condition that was visible, uncontrollable, and constantly misrepresented by a media ecosystem that had no financial incentive to tell the boring medical truth. His dermatologist confirmed it. His autopsy confirmed it. The science confirmed it at every stage and every way that science is capable of confirming a thing. And still for years, the narrative that persisted was the one that cast him as a man so self-loathing that he was chemically erasing himself. That narrative was not just wrong. It was wrong in a way that caused real harm to his reputation, to his mental health, to his ability to move through the world as a person rather than a projection of other people's assumptions. World Vitiligo Day is observed on June 25th every year. June 25 is the date Michael Jackson died. The observance was established in recognition of the awareness his journey created, the visibility he gave to a condition that most people had never heard of before his 1993 interview, and the complicated legacy of being the most famous person in the world to live with something the world refused to understand. A skin disease that he disclosed openly became, after his death, the very thing the scientific community used to honor him. Not for his music, not for his dancing, but for the brutal accidental courage of living publicly with something invisible to everyone but himself and the doctors who treated him. His DNA told us who he was. It told us about autoimmune disease and the cruelty of a body that fights itself. It told us about French Huguenots and enslaved ancestors, and the long American story of how biological truth gets buried under more comfortable fiction. It told us about melanocytes and haplogroups and the extraordinary precision with which science can now trace a person's origins across centuries and continents. What the DNA could not do, what no laboratory result has ever been able to do, is make people want to believe something that is less entertaining than what they already thought they knew. That has always been the real problem. Not the science, not the evidence, not the truth that was sitting there waiting to be read. The world had a story about Michael Jackson, and it preferred that story. The world had a narrative, and the narrative needed him to be something specific, something troubled, something self-invented, something that had rejected its own origins and tried to become something else entirely through sheer force of will and the darkest kind of vanity. That narrative was easier. It required no medical knowledge, no genetic literacy, no willingness to sit with the uncomfortable complexity of a human being whose life was genuinely, documentably stranger and harder than most people could imagine. But his DNA said something different. His DNA said, this man had 2 autoimmune diseases attacking his skin from the inside, while the world attacked his reputation from the outside. His DNA said, this family came from France through slavery, through survival, through a century of not knowing the truth about where they actually began. His DNA said the biology was never the mystery. The mystery was always the world's refusal to believe it when the truth was presented clearly, professionally, medically, and repeatedly. Michael Jackson is gone. He's been gone since June 25th, 2009, and the questions about his life have not stopped being asked because he was the kind of person whose life generated questions that outlive him. But among all of those questions, the ones that science can actually answer have been answered clearly, repeatedly, and with the kind of evidence that does not require you to take anyone's word for it. He had vitiligo. His body confirmed it. His doctors confirmed it. His autopsy confirmed it. His paternal ancestors were French, traced through the Y chromosome of a cousin he likely never knew back through an enslaved man who was the unacknowledged son of a French slaveholder in 19th century South Carolina. That is the biological record. That is the genetic truth. That is what was hiding in Michael Jackson's DNA all along. Not a scandal, not a conspiracy, not the dark secret the headlines promised, just the truth. Complicated, deeply human, fully documented, and deserving at long last of finally being believed.